Hello, my name is Emma Scott. I'm a research associate with the Centre for Science and Security Studies in the War Studies Department of King's College London. Today I'll be talking to you about sanctions on Iran and what the current path forward looks like in terms of lifting those sanctions. Firstly, by way of background and in terms of who is sanctioning Iran, there are a whole range of actors from across the international arena who have designated Iranian individuals, entities and vessels under both international and national regulations. Actors sanctioning Iran include the United Nations at the international level, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, Switzerland and Norway, amongst others. Some of the national sanctions designations result from a transposition of UN sanctions into national law, although not all of them do. US regulations by means of federal statutes enacted by the US Congress and executive orders issued by the US President are by far the most frequent source of sanctions against Iran. The US has in fact imposed restrictions on activities with Iran under various legal authorities since the seizure of the US Embassy in Tehran in 1979. However, since 2012 and even more so under the US presidency of Donald Trump, the pace of US designations against Iranian activities grew exponentially. The aims of the various sanctions regimes are multiple. They range from non-proliferation, preventing human rights abuses, anti-terrorism, halting Iran's destabilizing activities across the Middle East, as well as malicious cyber activities. Some would even argue that the aim of the sanctions is to destabilize and overthrow the Iranian regime altogether. However, while the sanctions have impacted Iran's macroeconomy as well as the informal economy and the overall welfare of Iran's population, evidence is scant that the sanctions have been effective in achieving their goals. In fact, Iran views the sanctions as illegal and has adopted a policy of resistance towards the sanctions. It specifically tries to evade them and has engaged in circumvention practices to shield the government and the economy from them. With the signing and subsequent implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is commonly known as the JCPOA in 2015, state participants to that plan agreed that Iran would receive sanctions relief in exchange for constraints and inspection and monitoring activities on its nuclear program. Notable sanctions relief included termination by means of a new UN Security Council resolution of all prior UN sanctions on Iran. This termination was subject to a potential reimposition through a snapback mechanism and incorporated restrictions relating to the sale of arms to and from Iran and relating to Iran's development of ballistic missile technologies. The sanctions relief package also included the termination of all EU nuclear-related sanctions, including those relating to Iran's financial and banking sector, energy and petrochemical sector, and shipping, metal and automotive sectors. From the US side, only secondary sanctions were lifted. Secondary sanctions are those that seek to extend US sanctions policy to non-US third parties. The lifting of secondary sanctions included only those for nuclear-related activities, such as those targeting again Iran's banking, energy, shipping, metal and automotive sectors. The sanctions relief did not include EU and US non-nuclear related sanctions such as anti-terrorism and human rights sanctions and cyber-related sanctions, and no primary US sanctions were lifted, so a US trade ban on Iran remained in place. This made for a complex sanctions landscape, even more so because the Obama administration continued sanctioning Iran for non-nuclear related activities. When Donald Trump came to office in 2017, he continued sanctioning Iran outside of US commitments to the JCPOA and subsequently withdrew from the JCPOA only to reimpose those US secondary sanctions which had been lifted as part of the agreement. He went on to impose additional counter-terrorism sanctions against the Central Bank of Iran, the Supreme Leaders Organization, senior Iranian government representatives, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. The former president also issued several new executive orders with sanctions targeting Iran's iron, steel, aluminium, and copper sector, as well as conventional arms sales to and from Iran, following the expiration of the UN conventional arms embargo. On the whole, the Trump administration left a complex and challenging sanctions framework, hindering the Biden administration from lifting the sanctions and coming back into compliance with the JCPOA. Although the current negotiations between the Biden administration and the Rouhani administration are likely to result in some sanctions relief for Iran in return for restraints on its nuclear program, at the end of those negotiations, various sanctions will remain in place. Iran's maximalist position in the negotiations is that all sanctions be lifted. Yet, this position is unrealistic, not only because it makes little sense to lift human rights, terrorism, and cyber sanctions in an agreement aimed at constraining Iran's nuclear program, but also because US domestic political sensitivities will constrain the Biden administration from lifting the sanctions. While Iran will also advocate for the lifting of the IRGC terrorism designation and the designation of the Supreme Leaders Organization, in effect to roll back the sanctions prior to Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, these appeals seem unlikely to succeed due to primarily a volatile regional situation. Essentially, key for Iran is the lifting of sanctions targeting its oil sales, foreign exchange reserves, and maritime, steel, and automotive and finance sectors. Although many sectoral sanctions may well be lifted, reaching an agreement will prove difficult because even the National Iranian Oil Company was itself targeted under counter-terrorism sanctions. On this occasion, Iran has stated that the issuing of executive orders to lift the sanctions won't suffice. It wants to see action in practice. However, with various designations likely to remain in place even after the sanctions are lifted, businesses are unlikely to suddenly rush to re-engaging with Iran. Thank you for watching this video. Please stay tuned for the next GeoTalk video and be sure to follow Gulf State Analytics on social media. Goodbye for now.